Good afternoon. I'm Patrick Lewis, the Director of Collections and Research at the Filson Historical Society. I'm so glad that you joined us for today's presentation, The Assault on Elisha Green, Race and Religion in a Kentucky Community. Randolph Paul Runyon is a retired professor of French and the author of 12 other books, including 2 on Kentucky history, The Mintells, Mary Todd Lincoln, Henry Clay, and the Immigrant Family Who Educated Annabelle in Kentucky, and Delia Webster and the Underground Railroad, both of those favorites of mine. I'll return to moderate questions after the presentation as time permits. Please join me in welcoming Randolph Paul Runyon.
Hello. Thank you, Patrick. I want to tell the Filson Society how delighted I am to have been invited to address you. I have fond recollections of when I spoke on the Mintel book a couple of years ago. I want to particularly thank, not in relation to this project, but to another possible future project, the assistance of Jenny Cole of Filson, Director of Collections Access. Thanks to COVID, I was unable to come to Louisville for my home in Paris, but for a period of about 2 or 3 months, she sent me photocopies of letters and found them for me that were of immense value, I hope, to a future project. On this particular topic of Elisha Green, I cannot begin without thanking Professor Charles Davis of the University of Kentucky, who wrote 3 articles in the Register of the Kentucky Historical Society that tell the story that I'm going to retell today, particularly the events of June 8th, 1883, the assault on Elisha Green, which took place on a Kentucky Central Railroad car traveling between Millersburg and Paris. The Reverend Elisha Green was traveling on that train from Maysville to Paris, June 8th, 1883. When the train made its customary stop in Millersburg, George T. Gould, president of Millersburg Female College, and music and calisthenics professor Frank Leslie Bristow came into the coach with their students, some 40 young women, who were on their way to Versailles to give a public performance that would involve both music, they had an orchestra, and a calisthenics exhibition. Seeing Elisha Green, whom he did not know at the time, seeing a Black man sitting several rows down in the front of the car, George T. Gould, the president of Millersburg Female College, thought it would be an easy matter to make him move to free up space for his students. He asked Johnny Martin, the train conductor, to make that gentleman, Elisha Green, leave his seat. But the conductor refused, saying that Elisha Green had bought a ticket in Maysville for that trip and for that seat, and he, Johnny Martin, had no right to make him give it up. Undeterred, Gould then went up to Green, grabbed him by the shoulder, and said, "You get out of here." Green stayed put. Gould began pummeling him with his fists, and then Frank Bristow, the music and calisthenics professor, joined in, swinging his brass-bound valise on Elisha Green's head, drawing blood. Joe Corrington, who was Gould's secretary at the college, drew back his coat to show the pistol sticking out of his pants pocket. Green said to Gould, "I paid for the seat in Maysville. I will hold it to Paris or die in my tracks. If you had asked me like a gentleman, I would have come out, but I will die before I will be pulled out like a dog." None of them would have known or cared, none of his assailants, cared that Green had never completely recovered from a train accident 10 years before that broke his leg in several places. It occurred as he was coming into Millersburg. The bridge collapsed under the weight of the train. Two men seated in the rear of the car, and on the present occasion, June 8, 1883, came up and offered their seats to Gould, but he refused. He insisted on making Green leave. Conductor Martin came up and told the professors he would throw them off the train if they didn't stop assaulting the passenger. Green had been born into slavery in Bourbon County, near Centerville, in 1818. He never knew his birthday because the records burned in a fire, and brought to Mason County at the age of 10, so 1828. There, he was still belonging to the Dobbins family by working at odd jobs under the supervision of John Porter Dobbins, who was a merchant in Maysville, and preaching at slave funerals. Elisha Green purchased his freedom for $500 on November 28, 1856, having been working in Maysville since 1838. He had bought his sister Harriet's freedom 3 years before then. He found the time to read the Bible twice through on the upper floor of Dobson's Maysville warehouse, where during the day he weighed and measured farm produce. Intensely religious, he was granted a preaching license by the White Baptist Church on Market Street in Maysville in 1845. And he soon founded his own church in Maysville. In 1855, he founded another church in Paris. Since then, he had been constantly traveling between those two towns, first by stagecoach and then by train, tending his flocks on alternate Sundays. That is why he was passing through Millersburg on June 8, 1883. On their arrival in Paris, John Barber, one of the two men who offered their seats in vain to Gould, was accosted by Bristow on his way out of the car, who asked him if he sympathized with Green. If he did, he could expect the same treatment. Barber said he was traveling on, but he went up to Green, whom he had known in Maysville, and offered to serve as a witness if Green wanted to pursue matters, wanted to press charges. Green did, and he found a lawyer who was willing to take his case, even though his wife, the lawyer's wife, had taught at the school where Gould presided. In fact, Gould had performed the marriage and Bristow had played the organ. That had been some years before. Throughout the summer of 1883, newspapers in Maysville, Paris, and Lexington gave the incident considerable coverage. Green, as the victim, elicited a fair amount of sympathy, and Gould, as the aggressor, began to lose some of the community support that he had enjoyed since he began at Millersburg Female College in 1872. After delays instigated by Gould and Bristow, and after Green's lawyer advised that a civil suit would be more likely to succeed than pursuing criminal charges, the case came before a Bourbon County jury in Paris in March 1884. Given the weakness of his case, Gould and Bristow's lawyer thought to belittle the plaintiff with racist remarks, but George C. Lockhart, the lawyer, Green's lawyer, convinced the 12 jurors to award the victory to his client. Green received a small amount in damages, and his assailants had to pay court costs. Altogether, about $800 in today's currency. So it wasn't negligible, but it was not the damages that Green had sought. Elisha Green, like Rosa Parks in 1957, thus triumphed over racism in public transportation. But unlike her, he was not trying to change the system, because Kentucky trains, perhaps surprisingly, in 1883, were racially integrated already. Segregation did not come until the Separate Coach Act of 1892. Green continued his pastoral career and served as a spokesman for the Republican Party, attending the 1885 presidential inauguration as a guest of Congressman William Wadsworth. Within a few months, Gould resigned from college and took a similar post in Las Vegas, New Mexico, from which he was soon fired. Green was a self-made man. I've given some sense of that, but I could go into more detail. How did he earn money on the side? How did he earn $500 to buy his own freedom, and that much or more 3 years before that, in 1853, to buy his sister's freedom? As I mentioned, he had two churches. He had one church in 1853, another one in 1855. That didn't pay a lot. But in his autobiography, he details how he earned extra money. He bought himself a set of silver spoons, and he said he got them off the floor, jokingly. The story he gives is that his boss, John Porter Dobbins, had given up his lost, had bought a lot of bacon. The bacon dripped on the floor, and Green took it upon himself, with his boss's permission, to find a way to scrape up that bacon grease and turn it into a product that could be used by a local candle maker. And then he got like $12 out of that and bought some silver spoons. So he scraped them off the floor, he said. He also caught rats and was paid a quarter per corpse. He later, once he was free, earned money by whitewashing houses, painting, carpentry. He became a cobbler. So he was full of ideas for improving his situation. To give a sense of the man, I'd like to read about a particular incident that occurred as he was traveling, as he did until 1872, by stagecoach. The train became possible after 1872. Traveling by stagecoach between Maysville and Paris and back again, he found that once after 1856 he was free, he had a harder time traveling as a freeman than as a slave. There were, of course, no conductors on a stagecoach, as Johnny Martin served to intervene in the assault on the train. So coaches had no representative of authority to resolve differences between passengers. Green recounts this story. As I was not a slave, I had some difficulty in traveling. Frequently, I'd be riding among slaves that had been handcuffed before, or as they were going south. The Negro traders and other persons would ask me. Since he says would ask me, that suggests that this kept happening in the stagecoach. Boy, where are you going? I would tell them, to Paris, from Maysville to Paris. What for? Continued they. Said I, to preach. Does your master allow you to go from Maysville to Paris to preach? Yes, sir. To whom do you belong? I belong to Mr. Green. And then he winks at the reader. Said I, he is, oh, Said they, he must be a very good man. And Green said, he is. He's a very good man. The explanation, Green comments, of my belonging to Mr. Green is this, that I had previous to this bought myself from my master. I was now my own master. On another occasion, and this was soon after he bought his freedom in late November 1856, the bridge for the stagecoach coming from Paris to Blue Licks had burned. The stagecoach route, I'm going to show you in a minute a picture, a map. Stagecoach route from Maysville to Paris went through Blue Licks, where the big hotel was, the Arlington. The stagecoach had to ford the Licking River. Green and the other passengers were obliged to get out and walk up the hill. A drunken passenger grabbed Green by the collar, cursed, and demanded to know where he was going. Another passenger told him Green was a preacher and to leave him alone. Green did not say a word. The drunk, with his hand still on Green's collar, cursed again and said he would make him speak. Green then told him to take his hand off his coat. The drunk refused. Green writes, I then knocked him about 20 feet backward down the hill leading up to Blue Licks from the Licking River. This was shortly after I had bought myself, he says. I will say that I was more of a slave after I bought myself than before. Before that, I could go many places without interruption. He wanted to attend a funeral, for example, in Ripley, across the river downstream from Maysville, 8 miles down, a funeral of one of the members of his parish, but he couldn't because, well, he was a slave, even he couldn't, because he had to have permission on paper from his master. I feel I should always have to explain what is my contribution to the narration of this tale that isn't already there. There's a lot that's already there. Number one, in Charles Davis' researches. Davis, by the way, is a descendant of George Lockhart, who was the lawyer who defended Green in March 1884. And then we also have, and you can read it online, the autobiography of Elisha Green that he published in 1887, from which I drew these stories. Well, what I did was I took a look at the whole picture, the complicated relations of kinship in the family that owned him, but switched him about from family member to family member from 1828 until 1838. I looked at the prehistory of his assailants and the post-history. For example, Frank Bristow was hard to believe, given how racist he was, but he fought for the Union in the Civil War. He was from Jacksonville, Illinois. It turns out, though, that his father was a Copperhead, that is a sympathizer with the South during the Civil War, and even ran for office on that platform in Jacksonville, Illinois. But Frank Bristow, young man in 1861-62, was so taken with the beauty of the Union uniforms and the catchy tunes that the band was playing, and being a musician himself, thought of that particular interest, that he signed up. And his duties were light because he became a bandmaster in the Union Army. And as he said, he serenaded Sherman on his march to the sea. George T. Gould was born in North Carolina. They were both born in the 1840s. Gould is a couple years older. And his father and family migrated to Louisville. and his father had not earlier been one. He was a tailor. He became a Southern Methodist preacher, and his son was studying for the Southern Methodist ministry at about the same time. And he served churches at various places from Louisville to other parts of Kentucky, before finally serving in Maysville, 1871 to 1872, where he decided his voice was worn out from public speaking. He would take another job, and he became the president of the college, which he had to invest in. And he borrowed money from his father-in-law to do that, which he never repaid. And he was always having money troubles. Charles Davis recounts some of the difficulties that Gould passed through from 1872 to 1884 or 85 as the president of this female college. And I go into somewhat more detail. Charles Davis pointed me in the direction of Owensboro, and I spent a lot of time there. There is a treasure trove of correspondence and church trial documents detailing the difficulties that Gould was experiencing before, during, and after the assault on the train, and that led to his resigning the presidency, leaving his wife, and then trying to start a new life at a similar female Methodist school in Las Vegas, New Mexico in 1884. And things were going swimmingly until, having been there a month or two, he received a telegram notifying him that his wife had brought charges against him in front of the church, before the church. And so he had to take a train back to, in this case, Mount Sterling and eventually Millersburg, to face charges. And so these documents, which detail his illicit sexual relations with various servants and slaves, well, servants, not slaves, during the entire time of his marriage, make for juicy reading, and were very interesting for the entire public to read about in the newspapers at the time. I would like to mention, because I think it's particularly piquant, that he made a farewell address to his college and his female students on June 4th, 1884. So this was after the trial. And he gave it the title, "She Hath Done What She Could." And it was an allusion to the anointing at Bethany, where a woman breaks oil and pours it over Jesus's head. And that leads him to talk about, to his students about to graduate, all female, what is an ideal wife? Although he did say many of them don't have to get married, there are many more jobs available for women. He says, he began to speak of the institution of matrimony, in which he encouraged the students to imitate the woman at Bethany and to do what they can, for a wife can make of her marriage a heaven or a hell. He says, many a woman has passed through life as pious and chaste in thought and deed as the snow itself, and yet she has driven her husband to distraction, has made him willing to curse God and die, has almost tempted him to lay violent hands upon his own life, and end his torment here by rushing into the torment which is to come. He said that in front of his wife, who was in the audience. And from reading the trial transcript of the church trial, we can figure out that he actually did claimed to have been so upset with his wife that he went to the drugstore and was going to buy poison. In the end, did not. Such a woman could drive a man, if not to suicide, as he said his wife almost did, at least to drink. And then that was the other big problem, because he was a roaring drunk and everyone knew it. He began a deep friendship with one of his students, Elisha Gould, and his wife complained of this in a letter to Texie, in which she said that she, the wife, her name was Ella, was crazy with anguish and shame, and having lost all respect for her husband, no longer loved him. And she predicted that if Texie were to marry him, she would become just as unhappy. She begged her to break off this infatuation for the sake of her own children. So that letter is among the trial documents. Gould was fired from the presidency of the Las Vegas Female Seminary. And bear in mind, it's not Nevada, it's New Mexico. In 1884, after his trial in October of that year. So he started a new life. Guess what? He went back to his old profession of minister, but now instead of being a man of the cloth of the Southern Methodist Church, he established his own church, as newspaper accounts in Kentucky sneered, with a very broad creed, one that would allow a person to leave his wife. He called it the Independent Temple, and he established it in Las Vegas, in the Opera House, Las Vegas, New Mexico. And so from November, December 84 until about a year later, when it ran out of steam, he preached weekly sermons, Sunday morning and Sunday evening, which still exist in archive in New Mexico. So there we see his theology, which became more and more liberal. What must I do to be saved? Well, nothing much. Just say you believe, that's good enough. People flocked to hear it because they wanted a more liberal theology, but eventually they tired of it. And some other ministers came to town, and that were, at least one in particular, that was just as liberal, in November of 85. So then he was in a hard place again. What's he going to do? Well, I should point out, though, that he didn't have only himself to think about, but also Texie. Because having left his wife behind in June of 84 and gone out west, and having been stripped of the cloth, defrocked from the Southern Methodist clergy situation in October of 84, he managed to get a divorce by going to a judge or a judge in chancery in a neighboring county in New Mexico in order to complain that his wife had abandoned him. This was apparently a very popular thing to do for men who went west and left their wives back east, is to pretend that they had been abandoned by their wives and sue them for abandonment. The trick was to go through the motion of publishing that so that the wife had an opportunity to come out west and tell the judge, no, I haven't abandoned him, he abandoned me, or I still want to be married to him, or whatever. And this happens in many cases, and it's exactly the formula that Gould followed. Because going to a neighboring county, bear in mind that in the county or the town of Las Vegas, New Mexico, Lexington and Louisville papers were reprinting any mention, because they took to the exchanges between editors, or they were essentially subscribers to, there were two papers in Las Vegas. Any news that mentioned Gould was usually reprinted in Kentucky. But by going to a neighboring county that had a paper that was so small that it did not extend beyond its own county, he followed the letter of the law, but not the spirit. And of course, she didn't know that he'd gotten divorced in this other county. So he gets divorced, and then he goes in May of '85 to Kansas City, Missouri, and Texie was from a Missouri family, and he marries Texie, and he brings her back to Las Vegas, and they start a new life together. The account in the newspaper ran thus, Las Vegas newspaper. On the morning, this is by beginning my paraphrase, of Monday, May 18th, '85, he took a trip to Kansas City. As he had the previous month, he promised to be back in Las Vegas in time for his church services on Sunday. The newspaper, The Optic, took note and of his return on Thursday, May 21st, so he wasn't gone long, of his return. Quote, he stepped from the train with a lady whom he introduced as Mrs. Gould upon his arm. They had been married on Tuesday evening at the Central Presbyterian Church of Kansas City. Quote, the young lady who captured the affection of Dr. Gould long months before he came to Las Vegas to make his home was Miss Texie Head of Howard County, Missouri, but who first became acquainted with the doctor at school in Kentucky, she being one of the instructors therein. She was actually a student. She is a blonde, aged 19, a lady of culture and winsome ways. The Optic is glad to chronicle this union of hearts where they've long pined for each other. So places a romantic coloration on his adultery. Gould then, when people stopped coming to his independent temple in November of '85, turned to a new trade, that of newspaper, eventually newspaper editor, but he began as a city journalist for the Las Vegas Gazette and later worked for the Optic. And he later got into an argument with the editor of the Optic, who misunderstood and thought that Gould had attacked him in print. And he hadn't, but it allowed the editor, whose name was Kistler, to say what he really thought of Gould. And he did in this article. Little Dr. Gould, because Gould was short, though heavy, he wrote, he was 5'5", has failed at everything he ever attempted. The list of failures would include the Millersburg Female College, the Las Vegas Female Seminary, the Independent Temple, and his current profession. To quote, his consuming self-esteem leads him into the ludicrous delusion that he is a newspaper man. He has never learned even the rudiments of journalism. On top of that, he was an apostate from the religion he professed and preached. This judgment comes from Kistler, a man who had known him for nearly 4 years and who, quote, has frequently, Kistler wrote of himself, under the influence of misguided judgments, spoken in complimentary terms of Gould, and has always honestly wished that despite his faults and failures, he might do well. But he cannot appreciate favors of this kind. He would, under the influence of his vicious temper, bite the hand that fed him every day of the year. He has no more sense of gratitude than a snake. Despite that, when Gould explained, well, I didn't really say what you thought I didn't really write what you thought I wrote, they reconciled. And he continued as editor in various papers from Albuquerque to El Paso, Las Vegas, and died in 1911 of a heart attack. What happened to Bristow? Bristow went with Gould to Las Vegas, New Mexico in July, August of '84. And then when Gould received the telegram telling him his wife had complained to him to the church and that he was going to lose his pastoral condition and had to go back to Kentucky, left Bristow holding the bag, running Las Vegas Female Seminary in his absence. By chance, word of the bad outcome, the bad verdict for Gould of the church trial arrived by mysterious accident in Las Vegas, New Mexico. A traveler to a neighboring springs about 4 miles away, but as springs were at that time a tourist spot, happened to have brought a copy of a Paris newspaper that gave the bad news of the negative verdict of the church trial. And so Gould was exposed, because then this went through the rumor mill in Las Vegas very quickly. And that led to him getting fired from that shop. Bristow then went back to Kentucky, lived with his parents for a while, was a music teacher in public schools in Covington. At the same time, because he had been an organist and conducted choirs at High Bridge, Kentucky, in Jessamine County, not far from Shakertown, but hard to get to on foot between the two, for summer religious camp meetings, and thought, oh, what a wonderful thing. I could make money with this. And so he had divorced his wife before. He courted and married a woman that he thought was a rich widow, who was not quite so rich. But with her money, he bought High Bridge, the campground. And he tried that for a while. And then she divorced him. And he had to give up because he was not doing very well running the religious meeting. One problem, or perhaps attraction, to High Bridge was that on weekends, people would come on the train from Cincinnati, from Louisville, from all over the state, and some would go to the religious meetings. Others were people plying their trade of gamblers, prostitutes, people selling liquor, and this would be in the woods surrounding High Bridge. And so the Methodists washed their hands of High Bridge because they didn't want anything to do with that criminality. I need to get back to Elisha Green, because that's what you probably wanted most to hear, but I'm just so entertained by the shenanigans of the two gentlemen who attacked him that I can hardly let go of their life story. Green had continued to run two churches on alternate weekends. And occasionally when he wasn't in one church, he would find out on a certain weekend that there was trouble brewing. So he had to come back quickly and get people to stop fighting each other. But eventually, because he was doing this from the mid-1850s until he died in 1893, a long time, and fashions changed, and his country style of preaching was not pleasing to the newer generation, and they wanted to form their own church. And both churches split about the same time. This was in June and July of 1884, just after he triumphed at the trial. There was a breakaway faction in each one. the one in Paris, the one in Maysville. The one in Maysville is especially interesting because it seemed to have been led and fomented by an ambitious pastor whose name was Benjamin Franklin. And he actually had gotten in trouble with his own church in Louisville and managed to conceal the fact that he had been fired from there for sexual shenanigans with the members of the congregation, to conceal that news, even though it was throughout the Louisville newspapers, from Maysville, and was hired and did very well until he decided to move on to Tennessee. And that church lasted until about 1914 in Maysville. I had a few pictures I'd like to show. And so let me see if I can get this to start. Good, okay, Elisha Green. The routes he took to get from Maysville to Paris. First, the stagecoach, that's the one on the western side, goes through Mayslick and Blue Licks, Millersburg and Paris. And then beginning in 1872, they finally completed the train. George Gould looks a bit fierce. Frank Bristow. Bethel Church, dating the building from 1875 in Maysville. He started the church 20 years or 30 years before, in 1845, and met in a different structure. It was destroyed by arson in 1971. This is his church in Paris, still extant on 8th Street. This is a bird's eye view of Paris, and I wanted to call your attention to this area here. This is Clayville or Claysville, and it no longer exists in quite the same way, but it was a way for enslaved people after the Civil War to have their own house. And a man named Samuel Clay owned the land and wanted to sell it. And he devised with Green, who told his congregation about it, that for $500, a person could have a house and a small parcel. And there are about 115 of those there were. Millersburg, it's kind of hard to see, but the college was here. Here's the college, the female college. There's another view of the female college. Schoolgoers Green was a piece for piano by Meininger, who was Bristow's predecessor as music professor there. Here's the train station in Paris, where they eventually arrived, and Bristow was threatened by, Barber was threatened by Bristow, and Green went up to the courthouse to look for a lawyer. Green, when he arrived in Mason County in 1828, was, and this is not quite understandable even to me, sold at auction in front of the Washington courthouse, which is where Harriet Beecher Stowe in 1838 or so witnessed a slave auction that supposedly impelled her to write her great novel. I say it's not quite understandable how he was sold at auction, because he wound up belonging to the same family where he had first belonged. There's Maysville, and here's Mayslick. He married Susan, his wife, until 1880, when she died, and he had to walk the 17 miles. Well, he could take the stage there, but then he had to walk back because he could get back on a Sunday night, and there was no stagecoach on Sunday. When he got as far back toward Maysville as Washington, he was stopped by a man who said, well, you must be an escaped slave, because that was the route that Delia Webster and Calvin Fairbank, for example, took with the Hayden family and other slaves over to Ohio, to Ripley, which is over there. And Green said, and the man said, I have a man to put you in jail. And Green said, great. I'm so tired. I don't think I can walk any further. I'd be glad to spend the night in jail and send word to Mr. John Porter Dobbins that here I am. So that worked out. Here's Maysville from the Germantown Road, and Maysville would be there. I have another picture of Maysville. You can see it a bit better. I just wanted to show you the river was there. I've figured out, here is, I didn't figure it out, everyone knows that this is, which says Colored Baptist Church. That was Bethel Baptist Church. Green lived here in this house behind the Methodist Church, across from Presbyterian Church and the courthouse. And he bought it from Lewis Collins. Here's Texie Head, later Texie Gould, whom he left his wife for, Gould. Here she is in a fine dress, living the life in Las Vegas, New Mexico. Here's Gould in a later picture, taken in the New Mexico years. Here is the congregation in the 1960s or very early 70s, telling by the car, of Bethel Baptist Church, the same church you saw without the white paint, but still brick. Long after Gould had departed this life. And after the arson, this is all that remains. And there's his tombstone, which unfortunately has the wrong year of his death. It was 93, not 92. Okay, I turned off the slideshow. Am I back?
You are?
Good, okay. You might have some questions to ask.
We do. We've got a few in here already. Thank you for that really wonderful presentation and the illustrations as well. That drive between Paris and Maysville is really one of my favorite in the state. So I encourage everybody to retrace the route of this story if you can. We've got a really good question here about journalistic conventions at the time. And is it common to write in local publications about local news and then spread that all over the country? You mentioned that there's this network of editors. I wonder if you could expand on the ways that really Americans, as they expand across a continent on a massive scale after the Civil War, keep in touch with the folks back home.
I think fully half of the content of a typical, say, Kentucky, probably true all over the country, newspaper in the 1850s or the 1880s was borrowed from another paper and usually given credit. They shared subscriptions. And so, as I mentioned, people back in Kentucky learned of Gould's divorce. There's mention in Danville paper and Louisville paper. It was pretty wonderful. The people could read what was going on all over the country. And it's also wonderful, and personally now, is that with newspapers digitized, I subscribe to a couple, newspapers.com and newspaperarchive.com. Since you can search for words, you won't always find them because it depends on how well the machine can recognize the print, and sometimes it can't. So you have to keep read every story. But I would search forever and ever, and found a lot of stuff about Gould. Trouble was that I often got Gould the railroad magnate, or I got Bristow his cousin was the wonderful. I forget his first name, but he was
Benjamin Helm
ran for president.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, and I think that's, and there's a whole genre of studies now that are using the power of those digitized newspapers to trace a story across the country and see how it might change, and if an editor puts a different permutation on it or a slightly different spin. But you can really, in ways that I think would be surprised at, or there was a culture of mass communication and continued knowledge and communication. Wanted to move.
I should also mention
please,
that local newspapers were the Facebook of the day.
Yeah.
Because people would give news, and whoever left town for a shopping trip somewhere, that was covered. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, absolutely. I know some faculty members who have used that in classes, and laying a column of a newspaper side by side with a Facebook feed, and you get ads, and you get news, and you get a joke, and you get some amateur poetry, and it's a little bit of everything all mixed there and together.
Absolutely.
You made a really interesting point earlier that I wondered if you could circle back to and elaborate on, about Kentucky and racial segregation in public transportation, and we've got a unique story there, and I wonder if you could go back and emphasize that.
Yes. I have a whole chapter almost, or at least a section in the last or the next last chapter about this. It's paradoxical. There was no segregation at the time in 1883 when the assault occurred, but in 1892, the Separate Coach Act was passed because Kentucky wanted to be like the other southern states and pass Jim Crow laws. They wanted to keep up with the Joneses. There was a particular incident that's very interesting that happened in October 1891, in which a woman returning up on the train from Louisville to Frankfort had been wounded by a stray bullet. And newspaper stories about it got it completely wrong, and were very racist in their treatment, because they claimed, oh, well, this black man did it, and he was upset because he sat down next to a white woman, and the white woman's boyfriend came back from the water fountain and started to fight, or they had some other story. I mean, neither story was really what happened. It was only when you look at a suit against the L&N Railroad that a Kentucky, I guess, Supreme Court or appeals court judge finally resolved that issue in favor of the L&N, but he actually told finally what really happened, and no newspaper account, and that was in 95. And apparently it was already a separate coach. That is, because black and white passengers seemed to the conductor to be kind of not getting along together, he put all the black passengers in one car and left the white passengers in the first car. But there was a white passenger in the car he had put all the black passengers in, who was picking on some of the black passengers, including one in particular. And so he left and stood on the platform, as they call it, between those two cars, to get back at the gentleman who had picked on him, who was back in now the predominantly entirely white car. And he pulled a gun and shot through the window, or maybe through the thing at the top, the transom, and missed and hit the woman. But he was actually not in the car. He had come from kind of the separate coach. So the irony of it is the separate coach would not have done a bit of good. So that's how segregation began. And at the time of in 93, the last year of Green's life, there was a great deal of agitation throughout Kentucky, but especially in Maysville, against this law. It was not going to take effect until late October 93, because year had to pass, or 18 months or something before such a law could. Also, the trains need to come up with new coaches. The trains were against this because they didn't want the expense of. So Green, as I point out, did not have to travel on a separate coach, did not have to endure that insult because he was sick and died before the law finally went into effect.
I'll point out that in the chat, we have posted a special discount code for the book, Filson 2022, which you can use at kentuckypress.com to pick up The Assault on Elisha Green for 30% off and free media mail shipping. Thanks to University Press of Kentucky for that offer. And then one more question before we get off here. You showed the very last image there, the really evocative image of the burned out foundations of the church with the stained glass still there.
Yes.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the arson of that church.
I think it's unknown who did it. In the Encyclopedia of Northern Kentucky, they say it was arson. I was not living in Maysville. I'm from Maysville, but I was living somewhere else, so I didn't know immediately about it. It was in January, I think, of '71. I wish I knew more about it because I think we have an unpunished crime. But I don't know if that was part of the various times there were a wave of church burnings or not. I wish I knew more.
Well, isn't that the way with every historical project? You always turn up a few more questions that somebody else hopefully picks up down the line.
Right.
So there's our call. We need either a journalist or a historian to pick that one up and run with it. That's all the time we've got this afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us for this presentation. It has been truly enjoyable, and thank you so much for all the really fantastic Kentucky history books that you've written. Have a good afternoon, everybody.
Good afternoon.